Hey everyone, welcome to week 2 of this course. This week we are going to pick up where we left off from last week, which makes sense because we're just telling a very long story. Last week we looked at the colonial era and ended with assessing some of the causes for the American Revolution, many of which stemmed from a discontent among the colonials about unequal representation and the growing suspicion that monarchy was becoming tyrannical and abusing its authority and abusing it in a way that the natural inalienable rights of humanity, particularly mankind, right, was supposed to have. And this is very much coming out of an Enlightenment context, particularly John Locke's notion of government and our responsibility to it. And so that's kind of what we looked at last week. This week, we're going to get into the American Revolution and the early republic. So we're going to be going from about 1776 up to about 1828, which is a period known as the Era of Good Feelings. We're actually going to be looking at two wars this week, the American Revolution and the War of 1812. And in many ways, the War of 1812 is actually considered the Second War of Independence because, again, we go to war with Great Britain, and again, we win. Although, as we will see with the War of 1812, it's really more by luck than anything else. That's the time frame for this week. Now, there's a lot that we are going to be covering, and so what I want to do is just sort of give you a basic preview of what some of this material is going to look like. So we're really going to begin in 1776, and in that year, the American Revolution has already begun, following the battles of Lexington and Concord, which took place in 1775. The United States is going to have to figure out what its position is going to be with Great Britain up to 1775. And even in the beginning portions of 1776, it's not very clear what the purpose for the fighting is, right? I mean, by the time that we issued the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776, we've already had the battles of Lexington and Concord. We will already have had the Battle of Bunker Hill, which, although the Americans lost that, it was a morale boost because it took the Brits about 3 different attempts and killed about 1,000 British redcoats before they could take the hill. But that battle has taken place. The Brits have landed a massive army on Staten Island, all before we even declare our independence. And so between 1775 and 76, it's not clear what the purpose for the fighting is. Is the fighting intended to bring about conflict resolution and Great Britain and the colonies kind of bend back together? Or is this going to be a breaking apart where we will declare our independence? Well, obviously, we know in the end it's going to be to declare our independence. But before that can happen, there's going to be a pamphlet that will be published in 1776, January of 1776, called Common Sense. And this was written by Thomas Paine, and you definitely want to spend some time looking through this week. But Thomas Paine's Common Sense basically made a series of arguments to basically convince those who were sort of straddling the fence about whether we should declare our independence that really monarchy is not the positive thing that many people thought it was. And he gives a bunch of different arguments about why the United States should in fact become the United States. And it really convinces a lot of people to begin the motion to declare independence. And although I would argue that the Declaration of Independence would have been issued eventually, I think Thomas Paine's Common Sense really expedites that process. And so by, of course, July 1776, we issue the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration is not a legal document. It has no force in law. It's basically a statement where we said, here's what we intend to do, and here's why we intend to do it. Definitely be looking this week at where you see Enlightenment ideas sort of finding expression in both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. I mean, when we take a look at someone like John Locke, he makes the comment that all men have inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and property. Well, in the Declaration of Independence, you see this taken almost word for word. Jefferson changes the last concept, property, to the pursuit of happiness, but you very much see John Locke's fingers all over the Declaration. And, as you're thinking about what one of these questions might be for the week, you might want to start thinking about how does the Enlightenment affect the American Revolution? Where do you see Enlightenment ideas being expressed by the Founding Fathers? Where are they expressed in the Constitution? The whole idea of separation of powers and checks and balances that makes up our Constitution. The idea that the power of government comes from the people. Right at the very preamble, we see "we the people," right? You want to be thinking about that stuff, okay? So then, of course, following the Declaration of Independence, we have a war because simply declaring you're independent doesn't necessarily make you independent. So we had to fight a conflict. Now, I'm not a military historian, and I'm not going to spend much time really focusing in on battles and tactics. But in the end, the United States will win this war. We, of course, have General George Washington, who had, I guess, the most experience of anybody at this point. I mean, he did fight in the French and Indian War, albeit he started the French and Indian War in many ways. But he fights the conflict. Ultimately, he is not super successful in the sense that every campaign he fought, he won. I mean, he had a couple of victories early in 1776 at the Battle of Trenton. He crosses the Delaware. He's got his major victory at Yorktown. But I wouldn't necessarily say that if I had to pick all the generals throughout human history that General George Washington would be the one I would pick. He's not the greatest tactician out there. Really, one of the main reasons why the United States was able to win the war is because of the alliance that we made with the French, which comes in 1778. And the reason why the French decide to ally with us is because of a victory in 1777 known as the Battle of Saratoga. Following the Battle of Saratoga, the French decide to establish a treaty of friendship with the United States. And those treaties say a number of different things. But ultimately, it's the idea that the French is going to provide for the United States a navy, which we sorely needed because the British, of course, have this fantastic navy, and we've got a little canoe, maybe a dinghy with, a paddle. It's not like we're going to be able to take the British out with naval force. And this is actually one of the reasons why we are victorious at the Battle of Yorktown, is because the French Navy was able to bottleneck up the British Navy and they weren't able to resupply the British troops at Yorktown, which is in Virginia. Okay. For those of you who are really interested in the battles and tactics and strategies, your textbook is going to give you more information on that. I'm more interested in the political and social ramifications of the American Revolution. And the truth of the matter is that politically speaking, the American Revolution was indeed revolutionary. I mean, we sort of instituted a new type of notion of self-government. Now, I will say this, the type of government that the United States eventually creates is not a democracy. We create a republic. Hence, if you say the Pledge of Allegiance, I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the United States for which it stands and to the republic, right, for which it stands, whatever. I haven't said the Pledge of Allegiance forever, but you get the point, right? We are a republic. But this type of government is somewhat unique. Not that there had never been republics before, there had, but what we are attempting to do is unique. But what I will say is that from a social point of view, that is the way in which the war affected different groups of people, generally you went from a bunch of rich white guys ruling the show to a bunch of rich white guys ruling the show. I mean, the status of Native Americans and women and African Americans didn't change that much. I mean, for women, they began to be seen more influential within society to a degree because of this concept known as Republican motherhood, this notion that women were the protectors of virtue and they needed to teach their sons how to be virtuous citizens and have moral aptitude and what have you. So this concept of Republican motherhood begins to affect women's roles a little bit. But socially speaking, women didn't change their roles much. They still were regarded as a second-class citizen and inferior in some ways. Of course, slavery is still intact. Native Americans are not treated much differently. And so when we think about the American Revolution as being a social revolution, we might have to really begin to think about this because in many ways it's not. Indeed, John Green in one of your films this week is going to talk about that. So think deeply about this notion of how successful was the American Revolution in actually making things revolutionary, right? I mean, John Green states this, and it makes total sense. A revolution is what? 360 degrees. You start where you ended. And in some respects, the American Revolution was just that. We had a bunch of rich white guys. Boom, we flipped around. We have a bunch of rich white guys. Now, in the end, obviously, the ideas of all men are created equal, embodied in the Declaration, that begins to come to fruition. But indeed, I think it's fair to say that in many ways, our founding fathers, at least on the face of it, by contemporary standards, and even in their own time, they had people who struggled with this. They were deeply hypocritical, right? Here you have Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration. I will say this because it's a pet peeve. Jefferson did not write the Constitution. The man wasn't even at the Constitutional Convention. He wasn't even in the country when it was written. He was in France, okay? But those ideals that all men are created equal, they definitely didn't live up to those. I mean, you cannot say that you are, in fact, a slave to British taxation when you are in fact holding slaves as people in bondage, right? Those two things are deeply hypocritical. And I think even Jefferson recognized slavery as being a moral problem. He himself will argue that black people are inferior to white people. He doesn't know if this is innate or what happens, but if you read his notes on the state of Virginia, then he talks about this sort of alleged inferiority of black people. And in fact, he argues that should emancipation ever happen, and perhaps Jefferson wanted it to happen, but he argues that should it ever happen, African Americans actually should be forced to go back to Africa, because he believes that there is no way for blacks and whites to ever get along together in the same society. Now, on its face, that is deeply prejudicial and deeply racist, but I will say that white people weren't the only ones who believed this to be true. African Americans, a number of them, particularly as the abolitionist movement begins to develop, they also believe that they're not going to get fair treatment as long as white society continues to have hold. White hegemony cannot remain in control, and African Americans, or any group for that matter, will not be able to live equally. Right? But in the end, we have a revolution. And immediately following that revolution, the United States establishes two forms of government. The first one fails. It's known as the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation were, on their very face, very, very weak. It created for a very descaled, decentralized government. And this makes sense why the Founding Fathers wouldn't want a strong central government. They had fought a war to try to throw off the tyranny of a strong central government. And so they established the Articles of Confederation as a way to sort of bring a sort of friendship and an alliance among the 13 now states. And the way that I talk about this in my classroom is this, is that when we talk about the development of union, and this is significant because when we get to the Civil War, there's going to be a discussion about union and what that union means, right? If we think of union as being something that can't be broken, my fingers would be like this. They're interlocked, right? It can't be pulled apart. What the Articles of Confederation does is it doesn't create a union like this. Rather, it creates a union that's more like this. These states are sort of playing with one another, right? They have some common interests, but for the most part, each state retains its sovereignty and its independence. We know this because the very first statements within the Articles of Confederation state that each state will be sovereign and independent. Now, the problem with this is that you cannot force the states to do anything. And the biggest problem that the federal government had following the American Revolution was massive amounts of debt, war debt. Each state had significant amounts of debt. Veterans are coming home. People aren't getting paid. In the end, this is going to lead to a rebellion known as Shays Rebellion, Daniel Shays Rebellion, because he's got debt that he has to pay off debts, but he's not getting paid from the war, and ultimately they rebel. And demonstrations like Daniel Shays Rebellion demonstrate that the federal government under the Articles was incredibly weak. I mean, it could not enforce any laws that it created. Anytime the Articles of Confederation had to be amended, you had to have a unanimous decision. You know, all the states had to agree. It couldn't tax, and so it couldn't force anybody to comply in paying off the war debt. It was a real mess. But what we have to bear in mind is that even though the Constitution will be created, and the Constitution by the preamble states that we are creating a more perfect union, you have to understand that for many people, and many of these folks we're going to say live in the South, when the Constitution is finally drafted and then eventually ratified, some people believe that in ratifying the Constitution, we went from playing with each other like this to interlocking. There are still many people, particularly in the South, who think that even after the Constitution, we are still not fully integrated. And when they wanted to leave the Union, they believed they had every right to do so. And we're going to get to that when we get to the Civil War. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But we do create a constitution, constitutional convention. It creates three branches of government: the legislative, which makes laws; the executive, which would be the presidency; and the judicial, which is the Supreme Court. We'll have some content, some videos on the breakdown of that later. But for now, just understand we create a three-branch system where each branch of the government can have checks and balances. Now, once that Constitution is ratified, and there's a huge debate about whether or not it should be ratified between a group known as the Federalists, those who wanted the government to be ratified, that is the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were very fearful of strong central government. They wanted to see the states have greater authority and autonomy. Once they finally ratified the Constitution, which it's finally fully ratified in 1788, and then eventually Virginia will ratify it in 1789. Once that happens, then we get our first few presidents. And Although I don't have time here to go through the presidencies of each one, just note that there are some significant conflicts that arise, both foreign and domestic, that our first presidents have to contend with. And much of the foreign problems, that is foreign policy that the United States is going to have to deal with, comes from conflicts between France and Britain. By this point, when George Washington is finally elected to the presidency in the 1780s, his presidency is going to be dominated by conflict in France. The French Revolution erupts, and the French, who had allied with us during the American Revolution, said, "You need to help us now." Washington's cabinet is made up of a group of people who do not get along, and they do not see eye to eye on anything. In fact, you'll be able to see some of the debates between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. These two people did not get along. But ultimately, the French think that they should help us, or we should help them rather. And in the end, George Washington says, no, we're going to be neutral. We're not going to get involved. But I will tell you this. From President Washington, then to Adams, then to Jefferson, and then finally on to Madison, there is massive conflict between the British, the United States, and France. Ultimately, the British will begin a process of impressing American ships and sailors. That is, they stop American ships, and we're not involved in their war, but they want to hinder the French and hurt their economy. And by hurting their economy, they think they can destroy them. And the French do the same thing to the British. And so when Americans come into international waters, and we are trading with both the French and the British, they begin to stop our ships, and this creates a lot of problems. And so in the end, ultimately, we will declare war against Great Britain and have the War of 1812, which we do successfully win following a treaty known as the Treaty of Ghent, which ends the War of 1812. Multiple causes for the War of 1812. Impressment of American sailors, definitely one of them. But there are also some other issues going on. The British, following the American Revolution, had promised to leave forts that were held in United States territory. They had not done so. And there was this belief, and rightfully so, that the British were inciting Native Americans to rebel. You can actually see this to a degree, I guess, if you want to look at it this way, during the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. But there's fearful that the Brits are attempting to overtake the United States by inciting Native American rebellions. And because the borders had not yet been solidified, there's a desire to oust the British out of what is now Canada and extend our borders north. In the end, we win the War of 1812, but we don't really gain much. In fact, it's regarded as a forgotten war. But what we do get from this conflict is the national anthem. A gentleman by the name of Francis Scott Key, in 1814, he is watching a bombardment known as the bombardment of Fort McHenry. And as the thing is going on, he's watching it all night long. And the only way that he knows if the United States is still, winning is to see the flag flying. And in the morning, he does. He sees the Star-Spangled Banner waving in the air, and hence he writes what becomes our national anthem. Now, following that, because I want to tie this video down, following that, we get this period known as the Era of Good Feelings. It was a time of intense nationalism, where the United States builds up its military. You begin to see massive industrialization. Textile factories begin to boom. Cotton is going to begin to boom. It is a unique moment. And the Era of Good Feelings ultimately will end with the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828. As you will see from other videos and your reading, there's going to be some conflict with Andrew Jackson and his opponent, John Quincy Adams, who is son to John Adams. So I could go on and on and on and on and on, but I'm already at close to 20 minutes here, so I'm going to stop this video. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and I will try and answer them for you. Otherwise, go through the rest of the material for this week. Be prepared for your questions that you need to submit, and email me if you have any questions. I'll get back to you, all right? All right, guys. With that said, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week.